You can tell a lot about a man by the rifle people laugh at. The desert range outside 29 Palms shimmered beneath the California heat like a sheet of warped glass, the steel targets nearly invisible beyond the waves of rising dust and mirage. And every Marine on the long-range qualification line looked exactly the same in their tan gear, high-end optics, carbon fiber rifles, and mirrored ballistic tablets clipped beside their scopes. Every Marine except the old man walking slowly toward Lane 7 with a faded canvas rifle bag hanging from one shoulder and desert gravel crunching beneath worn leather boots that looked older than half the platoon watching him. Staff Sergeant Tyler Boone noticed him first. "Hold up," Boone said, lowering his spotting scope as a grin spread across his face. "Who invited Grandpa?" A few Marines laughed immediately. Others turned their heads when the old man carefully laid the rifle bag across the shooting bench and unzipped it with the kind of slow precision that came from habit instead of age. Then the laughter grew louder. The rifle inside was painted orange. Not bright construction orange. Not fresh paint. It was an old, burned orange finish, chipped and faded by decades of scratches, heat, and weather until the metal underneath showed through like scars beneath old skin. The rifle didn't belong there. Not beside modern Marine sniper systems worth more than pickup trucks. It looked ancient. Long barrel. Worn stock. No digital accessories. No rangefinder attached to the rail. Just steel, glass, and age. One Marine near the back actually pulled out his phone. "No way," he muttered. "This is gold." Boone walked over with the casual confidence of a man completely certain he owned the range. "Sir," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Deer season's about 3 states north." More laughter rolled across the firing line. The old man didn't answer right away. He simply rested one rough hand across the rifle stock, thumb brushing near a deep gouge in the orange paint, as if checking whether it was still there. Then he looked up. Pale gray eyes. Calm. Steady. The kind of eyes that didn't move around much because they didn't need to. "Just here to shoot," he said quietly. Boone smirked. "That thing even reach 1,000 yards. Another Marine chuckled. "Depends if the museum lets him borrow ammo." The old man ignored them. He opened a small metal box beside the rifle and began laying out cartridges one by one with careful spacing, each movement smooth and practiced without a second wasted. Nearby conversations slowly softened as a few Marines started noticing something strange about him. He never rushed, never fidgeted, never looked nervous. Even the way he checked the wind felt different. No gadgets. No handheld meter. He simply stood still for a moment, feeling the air against his face while dust drifted low across the range floor. Second Lieutenant Rachel Vega noticed it too. She had spent enough time around old-school instructors to recognize certain habits modern shooters didn't use anymore. The old man wasn't scanning randomly. He was reading the environment itself. Heat shimmer. Flag twitch. Dust drift. Breath timing. "Who was that guy?" one Marine whispered. Boone shrugged. "No clue. But this should be entertaining." The old man finally lifted the rifle from the bench, and for the first time the Marines stopped laughing long enough to actually look at how he held it. Not stiff. Not tactical. Familiar. Like the rifle wasn't equipment. Like it had once been part of him. Sunlight flashed briefly across the old scope lens as rotor noise echoed faintly somewhere beyond the mountains, and the Marine recording with his phone zoomed in closer while grinning at the screen. This old dude's about to embarrass himself in 4K. But Rachel Vega kept staring at the orange rifle. Because suddenly, for reasons she couldn't explain yet, it didn't look ridiculous anymore. It looked dangerous. The desert wind shifted hard from the west about 10 minutes later, rattling the range flags in uneven bursts while Marines settled behind expensive rifles lined neatly across the concrete firing pads. And through all the movement and noise, Elias Mercer remained the only man on the line who looked completely still. Staff Sergeant Tyler Boone watched him through narrowed eyes now, not because he respected him yet, but because something about the old man had started bothering him. It was the calm. Young Marines bragged. Competitive shooters adjusted gear constantly. Even experienced snipers checked their data again and again before a long shot. But Elias Mercer had barely touched his rifle since taking it from the case. He sat quietly beside it like an old mechanic beside a trusted truck engine. "You planning to shoot today, sir?" Boone called out. "Or are you waiting for the History Channel to arrive?" A few Marines laughed again, though not as loudly as before. Elias finally reached into the front pocket of the rifle bag and removed a small cloth roll that looked older than the rifle itself. He unfolded it carefully across the bench. Inside were tools, so worn they barely looked military anymore. A tiny screwdriver with faded tape around the handle. A brass cleaning brush polished smooth by years of use. A handwritten dope card protected beneath cracked plastic. Boone leaned closer. You still using paper notes? Elias glanced up once. Paper does not lose signal. That earned a couple quiet reactions from nearby Marines. Boone smirked anyway. You know this is a live Marine Corps qualification range, right? Not some hunting camp in Montana. Elias ignored the comment completely. Instead, he lifted the rifle slowly and settled it against his shoulder for the first time. The entire firing line changed without anybody realizing why. It happened in seconds. The rifle stopped looking old. The man stopped looking old. Suddenly the shape of him behind the stock felt locked into place with unnatural precision. Elbows grounded perfectly, breathing slow, cheek resting against the worn comb like it had been carved specifically for him decades earlier. Second Lieutenant Rachel Vega noticed it immediately. That is not beginner posture, she said quietly. Boone shrugged. Everybody thinks they are deadly until distance proves otherwise. But Rachel kept watching. Elias had not once looked through a ballistic calculator, had not asked for range confirmation, had not checked atmospheric readings. He simply stared downrange while heat shimmer rolled across the desert floor in long, transparent waves. Then he closed his eyes for a moment. Just one moment. Wind brushed across his weathered face. Dust shifted low near the steel berm almost 2 miles away. Somewhere overhead, a distant helicopter pulse echoed faintly through the valley air before fading again into silence. Elias opened his eyes. Wind changes halfway out, he said softly. Boone folded his arms. You can tell that from here? Elias nodded once toward the horizon. You can see it riding the heat. A younger Marine nearby whispered. What does that even mean? Rachel answered before Boone could joke again. Mirage drift. Boone looked over at her. You buying this? I do not know yet, she admitted. But he is reading the range without electronics. Another gust swept through the firing line. Most shooters immediately checked tablets and scopes. Elias did not move at all. The Marine recording with his phone zoomed in tighter on the orange rifle. This thing looks like it survived Vietnam. That sentence lingered strangely in the air. Because for the first time since the old man arrived, nobody laughed after hearing it. Boone noticed the silence too, and his smile faded just slightly. He stepped closer to Elias and pointed toward the distant targets shimmering beneath the desert sun. Tell you what, Boone said. You hit steel at 1,800 yards with that antique. I will personally apologize in front of every Marine here. Elias slowly worked the bolt once. Smooth, heavy, familiar. Metal sliding against metal with a sound older than most men on the range. Then he looked up at Boone with calm gray eyes that carried no anger at all. Move it farther, he said. For a moment nobody spoke. Heat rolled across the range in slow shimmering waves while the last words Elias Mercer had spoken seemed to hang over the firing line heavier than the desert air itself. Move it farther. Staff Sergeant Tyler Boone stared at the old man as if waiting for a punchline that never came. Then a short laugh escaped him. You serious? Elias rested one weathered hand on the rifle stock. You offered 1,800. Boone spread his arms dramatically toward the distant steel targets. That target is already hard enough for trained Marine snipers. Elias nodded once. Then move it farther. The younger Marines began murmuring immediately. Some grinned. Some shook their heads. One corporal whispered, This old dude is either insane or legendary. Another answered, Probably both. Boone turned toward the range crew truck parked near the ammo shelter. Push the steel farther out, he shouted. 3,000 yards. A few Marines reacted instantly. 3,000. No chance. That is almost 2 miles. Rachel Vega kept her eyes on Elias instead of the commotion around him. The old man never reacted to the numbers. No widening eyes. No hesitation. He simply sat beside the orange rifle while the desert wind drifted across the line in warm, uneven bursts. Boone noticed it too, and it irritated him more than he wanted to admit. Most people flinched when distance increased. Most shooters started recalculating. Elias Mercer looked like a man waiting for a bus. The range crew slowly hauled the steel silhouette deeper into the desert valley, while spotters adjusted optics and Marines gathered closer behind the firing pads. Somebody stopped joking entirely and began recording carefully instead. Even the air on the range seemed to change. Less laughter now. More curiosity. Boone folded his arms. You know what happens if you miss, right? Elias looked downrange. Everybody misses eventually. Boone smirked. Good. Just making sure we understand each other. But Rachel noticed Boone was speaking louder than before. People did that when confidence started leaking. 20 minutes later, the steel target looked microscopic through the heat shimmer. Spotters confirmed the distance at just over 3,200 yards. Several Marines whistled under their breath. One sniper muttered, I can barely see the thing. Boone crouched beside Elias. That far enough for you. Elias studied the horizon silently for several seconds. Wind drifted left to right near the firing line, but farther out the mirage rolled differently, bending low across the desert floor in slow diagonal currents. He watched it the way sailors watched water. No, he said softly. Boone blinked once. No. Elias pointed farther toward the valley ridge nearly lost in the afternoon haze. Put it there. Even Boone laughed at that. Sir, that is close to 4,000 yards. Elias nodded. I know. The Marines behind them erupted again, but this time the laughter sounded uneasy. Rachel felt it too. Nobody pushed a joke this far unless they truly believed something impossible was about to happen. Boone stood slowly. Fine, he said. You want 4,000? You get 4,000. The range crew exchanged nervous looks before driving the target even deeper into the shimmering desert. The steel silhouette became nearly invisible now, swallowed by distance and heat distortion until it looked smaller than a thumbtack through most scopes. Boone returned beside Elias with a grin that felt forced around the edges. There, he said. 3,870 yards. Nearby Marines shook their heads in disbelief. One whispered, Nobody hits that. Another answered quietly, Then why does it feel like he already knows he will? Elias finally settled fully behind the orange rifle. The old sling tightened across his shoulder. His breathing slowed. The entire firing line unconsciously fell silent as the wind brushed across the range flags and distant heat waves twisted like smoke above the desert floor. Then Elias Mercer placed one finger gently against the trigger and said the words that made Rachel Vega feel cold despite the California sun. Now the distance matters. The entire firing line seemed to breathe differently once Elias Mercer settled behind the rifle. Conversations faded. Boots stopped shifting against the gravel. Even the Marines, still pretending to grin, now watched in complete silence as the old man adjusted himself inch by inch behind the faded orange stock with the calm patience of someone who had done this thousands of times before modern optics and ballistic computers ever existed. Heat shimmer twisted across the valley in transparent ribbons while the steel target sat almost 4,000 yards away, barely visible against the pale desert ridge. Through most scopes it looked like a fleck of dust. Through the naked eye it did not look real at all. Staff Sergeant Tyler Boone crouched beside one of the spotting scopes and shook his head slowly. Nobody can see that clearly from here, he muttered. Rachel Vega never looked away from Elias. I do not think he is looking at the target anymore. Boone frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Rachel pointed toward the distant waves rolling across the valley floor. He is reading the air. Elias rested his cheek lightly against the rifle stock. The old scope sat low and narrow compared to the massive modern optics surrounding him, but his eye aligned with it perfectly. No wasted motion. No adjustment frenzy. Just stillness. Wind pushed softly against the range flags behind him, but farther out the mirage drifted differently, curling left near the ridge line while hot air shimmered upward from the valley floor in slow, uneven currents. Elias watched all of it. Not the target. The space between himself and the target. A Marine near the back whispered, Why is he waiting? Another answered quietly, Maybe he knows something we do not. Boone checked the range clock impatiently. At that distance the conditions shift every few seconds. Elias spoke without lifting his face from the stock. Exactly. The answer hit differently than Boone expected. Calm. Certain. Like a teacher correcting a student who did not realize he was learning. Somewhere far beyond the mountains a helicopter rotor echoed faintly through the desert air. The sound faded quickly, swallowed by heat and distance. Elias slowly wrapped one finger against the trigger. Rachel noticed his breathing first. Long inhale. Slow release. Then stillness. Complete stillness. Even the Marines recording on their phones unconsciously lowered them slightly as tension crept across the range. Nobody laughed now. The old rifle no longer looked ridiculous beneath the California sun. It looked ancient in the way a warship looked ancient. Scarred. Surviving. Dangerous. Boone leaned closer to the spotting scope. He misses this, and everybody goes home disappointed, he said quietly. Rachel shook her head once. No, Boone glanced at her. No what? Her eyes stayed fixed on Elias Mercer. Nobody here is going to forget this either way. Dust rolled softly across the concrete firing pads as Elias exhaled one final breath. Then the rifle fired. The crack echoed across the desert valley sharp and heavy, followed by the metallic slide of the bolts cycling smoothly backward and forward in one practiced motion. Then came silence. Complete silence. Every Marine immediately snapped toward the distant target area. Boone pressed against the spotting scope harder. Nothing, he said instantly. 1 second passed. Then 2. The Marines behind him began shifting uneasily. At nearly 4,000 yards, even sound itself felt slow. 3 seconds. 4. A corporal near the rear chuckled nervously. Told you. 5 seconds. 6. Boone smirked faintly without pulling away from the scope. That is what I thought. 7 seconds. The desert wind swept low across the valley floor again, carrying heat and dust in slow shimmering waves beneath the afternoon sun. Then suddenly Boone froze. A sharp metallic clang rolled faintly across the desert, almost like an echo from another world. Every Marine on the firing line stopped breathing at the exact same moment. The sound arrived so faintly that several Marines thought they imagined it at first. A thin metallic ring drifting across nearly 4,000 yards of desert heat. Then the spotter beside Tyler Boone jerked backward from the scope, so hard he nearly knocked the tripod over. Hit, he whispered. Nobody answered him. The words sounded impossible. Boone grabbed the spotting scope himself and pressed his eye against it again, breathing harder now as heat shimmer twisted violently across the valley floor. There it was, the steel silhouette swaying slightly against the distant ridge. Fresh impact mark flashing silver beneath the afternoon sun. Boone blinked once as if his eyes had malfunctioned. No, he muttered quietly. No way. Around him, the entire firing line had frozen into complete silence. Marines who had laughed 20 minutes earlier now stared at Elias Mercer with expressions somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The old man calmly worked the bolt open and rested the rifle back onto the sandbag support without the slightest hint of triumph on his face. No grin. No speech. No reaction at all. Rachel Vega slowly exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath for almost 10 seconds. He accounted for the second wind layer, she said quietly. Boone turned toward her sharply. At that distance? Rachel nodded without taking her eyes off Elias. And the heat drift. One of the younger Marines shook his head repeatedly. That is not possible. Another answered in almost a whisper. We just watched it happen. The Marine holding the phone lowered it slowly now, no longer filming for a joke. His expression had completely changed. Who the hell is this guy? Elias reached calmly for another cartridge from the small metal box beside him while wind brushed dust across the concrete firing pads in soft rolling waves. The old orange rifle looked different now. Not strange. Not outdated. Heavy with history somehow. Like every scratch in the paint meant something nobody there understood yet. Boone stood up slowly from the spotting scope, his confidence cracking beneath the surface for the first time all afternoon. You got lucky, he said, though even he no longer sounded convinced. Elias slid the cartridge carefully into the chamber. Luck fades fast at this distance. A few Marines exchanged looks immediately after hearing that. The statement carried weight. Not arrogance. Experience. Boone glanced toward the target area again, still trying to force logic back into the situation. Nobody makes that shot without computers. Elias looked toward the heat shimmer stretching across the valley. The wind tells you everything if you stop interrupting it. Rachel felt a chill crawl up her arms despite the desert heat. That was not something hobby shooters said. That sounded old. Military old. The kind of phrase passed through sniper schools decades earlier before technology replaced instinct. Suddenly, a sharp electronic tone broke the silence near the range control station behind them. Then another. A radio operator frowned down at his console. What the hell, he muttered. Boone turned halfway. Problem. The operator ignored him, staring at the monitor now. Range Evaluation Network just flagged something. Another tone echoed through the station. Then another. Nearby personnel started gathering around the screen, while the Marines on the firing line remained locked on Elias Mercer and the faded orange rifle resting across his bench. The radio operator picked up the handset slowly. "Control to command verification," he said carefully. "We just recorded an extreme distance confirmed steel impact." Static crackled briefly through the speaker. Then a voice answered immediately. "Shooter identification?" The operator looked down toward the registration clipboard beside lane 7. His eyes narrowed slightly as he read the name written there in faded black ink. Shooter is listed as Elias Mercer. Silence hit the radio for 2 full seconds. Then the unknown voice returned, lower this time. "Repeat the name." The wind shifted hard across the valley again, snapping the range flags sharply east while the Marines watched the old veteran in complete silence. The operator swallowed once. "Elias Mercer." This time the answer came instantly. "Stand by. Do not let him leave." The mood on the range changed so fast, it almost felt physical. A few minutes earlier, Marines had been laughing, filming jokes, trading sarcastic comments beneath the desert sun. Now nobody seemed sure where to stand or what to say. The wind still rolled across the valley in warm, dusty waves, but the easy confidence had vanished from the firing line completely. Staff Sergeant Tyler Boone stared toward the range control station where radio traffic had suddenly become nonstop. 2 operators were speaking in clipped voices, while another typed rapidly into a terminal connected to the long-range evaluation network. Every few seconds, another alert tone echoed from the console speakers. Boone looked back toward Elias Mercer. The old veteran sat quietly beside the orange rifle with both hands resting loosely across his knees, as if nothing unusual had happened. Rachel Vega stepped closer to the bench. "You knew the network would flag that shot?" Elias shook his head once. "Did not know they still used those systems." Rachel studied him carefully now. "Used them for what?" Before Elias could answer, one of the radio operators suddenly stood upright in his chair. "Sir," he called toward Boone, "Higher Command is requesting visual confirmation of the shooter." Boone frowned. "Visual confirmation?" "Yes, Staff Sergeant." The operator hesitated before continuing. "And they specifically asked if the rifle has orange markings." Silence spread across the nearby Marines again. Boone slowly turned back toward the old rifle resting across the sandbags. The chipped orange paint no longer looked random now. It looked intentional, deliberate, like a marker from another time. Boone walked closer to the bench, his earlier arrogance fading more with every passing minute. "Who are you exactly?" he asked quietly. Elias looked out toward the distant valley instead of answering. Heat shimmer drifted across the desert floor, while the steel target remained almost invisible beneath the pale afternoon haze. "Just an old shooter," he said. Boone shook his head immediately. "No, nobody gets flagged by command for being just an old shooter." Nearby Marines remained completely silent now, listening to every word. The radio operator lifted the headset again. "Yes, sir," he said into the microphone. "Confirmed. Orange rifle. Shooter identified as Elias Mercer." A pause followed. Then the operator's expression changed instantly. "Understood." He slowly lowered the headset and looked toward Boone with visible uncertainty. "Command says to suspend all active qualifications immediately." Boone blinked once. "Suspend the entire range." "Yes, Staff Sergeant." "For what?" The operator swallowed. "They said someone important is already en route." A low murmur spread through the Marines standing behind the firing line. One corporal whispered, "Who shuts down a Marine range over one shot?" Another answered quietly, "Someone with stars on their collar." Rachel noticed Elias finally glance toward the sky for the first time. Far in the distance beyond the mountains, the faint rhythmic pulse of helicopter rotors had returned. Still far away, but getting louder. Boone heard it too. "You know who is coming?" Elias remained silent for several seconds before answering softly, "Maybe." The desert wind shifted harder now, snapping the range flag sharply east while dust rolled across the concrete in thin spinning sheets. Several Marines unconsciously straightened their posture as the helicopter sound slowly grew larger overhead. The same Marines who had laughed at the orange rifle earlier now stood motionless around it, like museum guards protecting an artifact they suddenly realized mattered. Rachel crouched beside the bench and studied the old rifle more closely. Beneath years of faded paint and scratches, she noticed something partially hidden near the rear of the stock. A small black symbol worn almost completely away by time. Not commercial. Military. Boone saw it too. What unit is that from? Elias looked down at the old marking for a long moment before answering. A unit that does not exist anymore. The helicopter sound grew louder above the valley, deep and heavy now, and every Marine on the range slowly turned toward the horizon as a dark aircraft shape emerged through the shimmering desert heat, headed directly toward them. The helicopter came in low across the desert ridge with a deep rhythmic pulse that rolled through the valley floor and rattled loose dust across the firing line. Marines instinctively straightened as the dark military aircraft descended toward the range perimeter in a storm of hot wind and sand. Nobody spoke now. Nobody laughed anymore. Staff Sergeant Tyler Boone watched the aircraft settle onto the hard-packed desert beyond the berm while the downdraft snapped range flags violently sideways. The side door opened before the rotors fully slowed. Two military police officers stepped out first, followed by a tall gray-haired officer wearing desert utilities with Lieutenant General stars across his collar. The effect on the range was immediate. Marines locked upright at attention without needing a command. Boone felt his stomach tighten slightly. Lieutenant General Raymond Holloway was not the kind of officer who arrived unexpectedly for routine range evaluations. Holloway moved across the gravel with quick, controlled steps, ignoring everyone around him at first. Dust swirled around his boots while the helicopter rotors thundered behind him. One captain hurried forward to greet him, but the general walked straight past without slowing down. His eyes were fixed on only one thing: the orange rifle resting across lane 7. Elias Mercer remained seated beside the bench, calm as ever, one hand resting lightly against the worn rifle stock, while the entire range stood frozen around him. General Holloway slowed several feet away. For a moment, neither man spoke. The desert wind rolled softly between them, carrying heat, dust, and the distant metallic creak of the steel target far across the valley. Boone looked between the two men in growing confusion. Then the general quietly removed his sunglasses. "I knew nobody else could still make that shot," Holloway said softly. Several Marines exchanged stunned looks immediately. Elias gave the faintest nod. "You are late, Raymond." Boone nearly stopped breathing after hearing the name spoken aloud. Not General Holloway. Raymond. The general actually smiled for the first time since arriving. It was not the smile of a powerful officer greeting a civilian. It looked more like relief. "I heard the alert come through the network," Holloway said. "I thought the system malfunctioned." Elias glanced toward the distant mountains. Systems fail all the time. A few Marines shifted awkwardly behind Boone now, realizing they were witnessing something far beyond ordinary military protocol. Rachel Vega watched the general carefully. Respect was written all over him. Not ceremonial respect, personal respect. Holloway stepped closer to the rifle bench and stared down at the faded orange paint running along the old stock. His expression changed instantly. "You kept it exactly the same," he said quietly. Elias brushed his thumb across the worn surface. "Paint still works." Boone frowned slightly. "Sir," he finally said carefully, "what exactly is that rifle?" The general looked up at him slowly. "That rifle saved 36 Marines in the Cunard Ice Corridor before you were born." Silence hit the firing line again. Even the helicopter crew, standing near the aircraft, stopped moving. Boone stared at the orange rifle differently now. Not like equipment. Like history sitting on a shooting bench beneath the California sun. Holloway pointed toward the black symbol barely visible near the rear of the stock. "Do you know what that marking means, Staff Sergeant?" Boone shook his head once. The general looked back toward Elias before answering. "It belonged to a reconnaissance unit, so classified most records were erased after the operation ended." Rachel felt her pulse quicken slightly. "What operation?" Holloway kept his eyes on the rifle. "The operation where one man held an entire mountain valley together with distance and patience." Wind drifted softly across the range again, while Elias remained completely silent beside the old rifle. Then Holloway looked directly at Boone with calm, steady eyes. "And if Elias Mercer had missed that shot 38 years ago," he said quietly, "I would not be standing here today." No one moved after General Holloway finished speaking. The desert range had become completely silent except for the steady pulse of helicopter rotors cooling behind the berm and the soft hiss of wind dragging dust across concrete. Marines who had spent the afternoon joking now stood frozen around Lane 7 staring at Elias Mercer like they were trying to reconcile two different realities at once. The quiet old man beside the faded orange rifle no longer looked ordinary. He looked buried, like something history had forgotten to remove from the battlefield. Boone slowly glanced toward the rifle again. "You were saying he made a shot like this before?" Holloway kept his eyes on the old weapon. "Far worse conditions." Rachel Vega stepped closer. "What happened?" For several seconds the general did not answer. The afternoon sun hung low over the valley now, casting long shadows across the firing line, while heat shimmer drifted slowly beyond the distant steel target. Finally Holloway spoke. "Winter of 1988, he said quietly. Northern Mountain Corridor near the Afghan border. Recon operation collapsed during a whiteout storm. Several Marines exchanged looks immediately. Holloway continued without raising his voice. Visibility near zero. Frozen ridgelines. Radio interference. We were trapped in a valley with no clear extraction route." As he spoke, even the desert seemed to fade beneath the weight of the memory. Elias remained silent beside the bench, one hand resting against the old orange stock while the general stared somewhere far beyond the California mountains. "Back then I was just a young lieutenant trying to prove I belonged there," Holloway said. "Thought technology and maps could solve everything." A faint smile crossed Elias Mercer's face for the first time all day. Holloway noticed it. "He warned me the mountain winds were changing." Boone frowned slightly. "Without equipment?" Holloway nodded. "He watched snow drift move across the ridges and told us we had less than 15 minutes before the entire corridor disappeared." Rachel listened carefully now. Every Marine on the range did. "Then communications failed," Holloway continued. "Navigation systems froze. We lost visual markers. Most of us could barely see 20 feet ahead." The general looked down at the orange rifle, but Elias could still read distance. Wind rolled softly through the desert range as Holloway's voice lowered further. There was one narrow opening across the valley, small enough that nobody believed a signal round could pass through cleanly at that distance. Boone stared. "So what did he do?" Holloway slowly exhaled. "He painted the rifle orange." Several Marines blinked in confusion. Rachel looked down at the faded stock again. "Why?" "Because visibility was collapsing fast," Holloway answered. "He said if anybody survived that mountain, they needed to recognize the rifle instantly through snow and fog." Silence settled over the firing line again. Suddenly the orange paint no longer looked strange at all. It looked practical, human, like a decision made under pressure decades earlier that somehow never stopped mattering. Holloway pointed toward the deep gouge near the center of the stock. "That scratch happened on frozen rock during the longest shot I ever witnessed." Elias finally spoke quietly. "Wind almost took the round off the ridge." Holloway gave a soft laugh. "Almost." The general turned slowly toward the Marines gathered around them. "That shot created an opening wide enough for 36 Marines to move before the storm sealed the corridor completely." Nobody spoke after hearing that. Even Boone looked shaken now. "And the rifle?" he asked quietly. Holloway looked back toward Elias Mercer. "After the operation, Command wanted the weapon archived." The general paused briefly before adding, "Elias refused." Rachel glanced at the old veteran beside the bench. "Why?" Elias brushed his thumb slowly across the faded orange paint, while warm desert wind drifted through the range one more time. "Because rifles are not history," he said softly. "The men beside them are." The sun had started dropping behind the western ridge by the time the range finally moved again. Long shadows stretched across the concrete firing pads while warm evening wind rolled softly through the valley carrying the smell of dust, hot metal, and aviation fuel from the helicopter resting beyond the berm. Nobody had resumed qualification drills. Nobody even mentioned it. Marines remained gathered quietly around Lane 7, as if stepping away might somehow break whatever moment they had just witnessed. Elias Mercer slowly began packing his equipment with the same calm precision he had shown all afternoon. One cartridge at a time into the small metal box. Cleaning cloth folded neatly. Rifle bolt checked once before closing the case halfway. No dramatic speeches. No effort to hold attention. General Holloway stood nearby with his hands behind his back watching silently, while Staff Sergeant Tyler Boone remained frozen a few feet away, struggling to find words that no longer sounded small. Finally, Boone stepped forward. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as every Marine nearby unconsciously watched him. The same staff sergeant who had laughed first now stopped directly beside the orange rifle and looked down at the faded stock for several seconds before speaking. "Sir," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Elias looked up calmly. Boone swallowed once. "I thought you were some old guy trying to relive the past." Wind brushed across the range flags behind them while the last sunlight reflected softly along the worn edges of the rifle scope. Elias rested one hand against the orange stock. "Most people do." Boone shook his head slowly. "Not anymore." For a moment, neither man said anything else. Then Boone did something that surprised every Marine standing there. He came to full attention. Perfect posture. Eyes forward. A formal salute held steady beneath the fading California sky. Silence spread across the entire range. One by one, other Marines slowly followed. Some awkwardly, some immediately. Within seconds, nearly every Marine along the firing line stood saluting the old veteran they had mocked only hours earlier. Rachel Vega watched Elias carefully. His expression never changed much, but something softened briefly in his eyes as he looked across the line of young Marines standing motionless before him. General Holloway raised his own salute beside them. The helicopter crew did the same. Even the range officers near Control Station turned toward Lane 7 and stood silent beneath the desert wind. Elias looked down at the orange rifle one final time before slowly returning the salute. No speech followed. No ceremony. Just silence heavy enough to say everything words could not. After several long seconds, Holloway stepped forward and removed a single cartridge from his uniform pocket. Brass worn slightly dull with age. He placed it gently onto the shooting bench beside the rifle. Boone looked at it curiously. Holloway spoke without taking his eyes off the cartridge. "Last round from the Cunner corridor." Elias stared at it quietly for a moment before giving the faintest nod. "Thought that was lost." "Not lost," Holloway answered softly. "Just waiting to come home." The desert wind rolled through the range again, softer now, carrying the distant creak of steel far across the valley where the impossible shot had landed. Elias carefully picked up the old cartridge and placed it into the metal box beside the others. Then he finally closed the rifle case completely. The sound of the zipper sliding shut seemed strangely final in the evening air. Without another word, he lifted the faded canvas bag onto his shoulder and started walking slowly toward the parking lot beyond the range. Marines stepped aside quietly to let him pass. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. They simply watched the old veteran disappear beneath the orange desert light while the wind drifted across the valley one last time. And long after Elias Mercer was gone, the Marines still stood there in silence beside the empty firing lane, staring at the distant target almost 4,000 yards away, understanding for the first time that respect was never something earned through noise, rank, or technology. Sometimes it arrived quietly, carried by distance, patience, and the steady hands of someone history almost forgot.